everyone, welcome to Enlightened Tutoring. So my name is Lucy and I am an experienced A Level History and Politics lecturer. I also work as an examiner as well for A Level History, and today I'm going to take you through how to answer a 20-mark AO1 question. Now, the focus of this particular video is going to be on a paper 1 question from Route G. So that's focusing on Germany and West Germany between 1918 and 1989. However, if you're not studying this particular option, then you can still watch along, but what I would advise is that as I go through one of the questions from Route G, I would follow along with the question from one of your own option choices. Now, the skills and the way that you would tackle this question, the advice would also correspond with the AO1 questions that also feature on papers 2 and 3 as well. So again, if you were also watching along and you wanted to tackle a AO1 question from paper 2 or paper 3, then again just follow through, but instead of going through the question that I have chosen, which is one on the FRG, instead you would go through a question that you've chosen. So let's get into the business end. So when we're talking about AO1, what do we actually mean by AO1? Well, it's an assessment objective, and AO1 actually counts for the most marks that you'll get across A-level history when you are studying the Edexcel specification. So if you are studying the Edexcel specification, you'll know that you will have to sit 3 papers as well as a piece of coursework. Paper 1 is your breadth option, paper 2 is your depth option, paper 3 is your breadth and depth option, and then your coursework is on either a topic that's been chosen by you or has been chosen by your centre. So what is AO1 for Edexcel? Well, AO1 asks us to demonstrate, organise and to communicate knowledge and understanding, to analyse and evaluate the key features related to the period studied, making substantiated judgments and exploring concepts as relevant of cause, consequence, change, continuity, similarity, difference and significance. Now, it doesn't matter which route or which option you are doing, the assessment objectives across the entire Edexcel A Level History specification never change. So it doesn't matter if you are following Route G or you're following Route A, or if you are doing option 31 or you're doing option 35, the assessment objective stays the same. And what AO1 is all about getting us to do is demonstrate to the examiner, show the examiner that we have knowledge of the period, the factor, the theme, the concept that we are discussing within our essay. Now, we're not going to look at AO2 or AO3 in this video, but I will do videos in the future tackling AO2 and AO3 questions. However, even in those questions, there are still some marks that are available for AO1. So AO1, like I say, it's all about showcasing to the examiner that we know what we're talking about, basically. And AO1 forms itself around these second order concepts, and they feature right at the end. If I get the laser point out, right at the end of the assessment objective right there: cause, consequence, change, continuity, similarity, difference and significance. All of your questions will ask about one of those second order concepts. So if it's asking about cause, was a particular factor a cause towards something? So the question that we're going to look at today is going to be partly looking at cause, because it's going to be talking about whether or not democratic government led to political stability within the FRG between 1945 and 1989. But you can also get questions about consequence. What was the most significant consequence, for example, of the March on Rome in Italy. You can also get questions on change. What was the most significant change? So the other option, the option that I teach for paper 3 is option 31, rebellion and disorder under the Tudors. So a change question that we can get for that option can be, what was the most significant change between in the relationship between church and crown between 1485 and 1603? We can also get continuity questions. To what extent did something stay the same, or to what extent did something change? So one of the questions that we've had previously for paper 1 in regards to this is, to what extent did attitudes towards women stay the same between the Weimar period and the FRG period? So it asks you across the entirety of the period studied as part of Route G, which is 1918 to 1989. We can also get similarity, difference and significance as well. Now, it's important that you recognise these second order concepts when it comes to answering your AO1 question. It is something that we will be looking for as examiners. So, as I said previously, AO1 questions feature on every single paper that you will sit as part of your Edexcel A Level in History. It is the only assessment objective to feature across all 4 components. So there's AO1 questions on papers 1, 2 and 3. In paper 1, your AO1 questions are section A and section B. In paper 2, your AO1 question is section B. In paper 3, your AO1 sections are section B and section C. And in your coursework, 5% of your marks come from AO1. So whilst the main focus of your A-level history coursework in terms of assessment objectives is AO3, which is all about your ability to understand historical interpretations, we're still looking for you to be able to demonstrate that you understand the time period that you're talking about and not just simply regurgitating what other historians have said. So let's get into this paper 1 question then, and thinking about structure. Now, again, structure is one of the most important parts of any essay question. It doesn't matter whether you are sitting history, whether you're sitting politics, sociology, English language, English literature. If you're sitting an essay-based subject, then you must ensure that you are following an essay structure. Now, essay structures are not prescriptive. You don't have to follow one specific one. What I would recommend is trying different ones to maybe see which one works best for you and how you can communicate yourself in the best way. But as a general rule of thumb, for your AO1 essays, they should comprise of 3 main sections. First and foremost is an introduction. Now, A-level history essays should always include an introduction. Now, some people recommend for source and interpretation questions not to include an introduction. However, I find it best to include an introduction because it just helps you to set the scene. Now, when it comes to the AO1 in particular, it is really, really important that we include an introduction because that is part of the setting the scene for the examiner or for your teacher. So your introduction should always introduce your debate, and it should provide your judgment. That judgment shouldn't change throughout the entirety of your essay. Yes, you are going to look at different perspectives on the topic you are exploring, but ultimately your judgment should be the same in your introduction as what it is in your conclusion. You should then also have a main body of your essay, and this is where your argument, your debate is going to take place. Now, I would recommend completing 3 paragraphs. You might be able to squeeze in 4, but what you've got to remember is that for this question, you've got 45 minutes to write it. And when you say that, it sounds like quite a long time, but believe me, when you actually get into the exam and you start writing, those 45 minutes will go by in a flash. So try and aim for 3 detailed PEEL paragraphs. Now, you might have heard of PEEL before, but I recommend a PEEL structure for A Level History. The extra E is for the evaluation, because if you're wanting to hit into that level 5 for your responses, if you're wanting to hit the top marks in your AO1 response, you must evaluate, you must demonstrate to the examiner that you understand that there is an alternative perspective, that there is an alternative argument, or that evidence can be interpreted in a different way. Because as historians, we can take information, but depending on our point of view, or which lens we're looking through, or what evidence we've got access to, we can interpret it in different manners. The final section of your essay is going to be your conclusion, and I always say with the conclusion, nothing new, let's review, because your conclusion should contain absolutely no new information. There should be nothing in your conclusion that you have not already mentioned in your main body. Okay, because your conclusion is almost like, think of it as like wrapping up the present and putting the bow on top. Essentially, we're finishing off, we're adding the sauce at the end of making our delicious meal, or we're adding the finishing touches, we're adding a few decor pieces to the room that we are decorating. It is the finishing touches. So we are summarising the debate that we have had in the main body. We're summarising what we've been discussing. We're also talking about our judgment. Now, one of the key points, and I found that students sometimes struggle with this quite a lot, is criteria. For Edexcel, you have to state what your criteria is. And students, I find, often get a little bit confused about that. But the easiest way to think about it is, how do you make your decision? So when you get dressed in the morning, you don't just pull out the first thing. You might look out of the window and have a look and see what the weather's like. If it's a hot day, you're not going to put a hat and scarf on and your Ugg boots. You might put a dress on, for example, or you might put a pair of shorts on, or you might wear a t-shirt or not decide to wear your coat. Your criteria for judgment there has been the weather. And it's exactly the same here, except we're not talking about what you've decided to wear that morning, but we're talking about how you're arriving at the judgment that you're giving. So how are you arriving at agreeing that whether or not the biggest change in church-crown relationship was the transferal of power from the church to the crown? So that's what we're looking for in your conclusion, it's a summary of your debate, but also you justifying your judgment. So how long should you spend then on an AO1 question? Now, these timings don't change whether you're doing paper 1, paper 2 or paper 3, but what I will say is that these timings are going off you having the allocated amount of time within your exam. So for paper 1 and paper 3, that's 2 hours and 15 minutes, and for paper 2, that's an hour and a half. Now, if you're entitled to extra time, you would need to change these timings up a little bit depending on how much extra time you have been awarded as part of your concessions. But going through this is working on that you would have the usual allocated time by the exam board. So how long would I recommend that you spend on an AO1 question? Well, I would recommend in total that you should spend around about 45 minutes writing your AO1 response. Now, within that, you want to split it into 2 separate parts. First and foremost, you want to plan. Now, when students say to me, "Oh, but Lucy, I don't plan. I prefer to just go into things and just write it." I get it. I totally do, because if I'm completely honest, I was that A level student when I did my own A levels. However, planning is so helpful, even if you just jot down a few of your ideas, because it helps you to stay on track with what it is that you're talking about. It helps you to go back and remember. I've had some students before who, when they've seen the questions, have just written down everything that they can remember about that particular area, because exams are high pressure environments, and sometimes we do forget things, and as examiners we recognize that the human memory is not infallible. Okay, so it is super important to plan, even if it is jotting down a few of your ideas, so that you know which way it is that your essay, your response, your debate, your argument is going to go. Another reason why it is also really important to plan is, whilst you might be looking at those paper times and thinking, wow, 2 hours and 15 minutes for paper one, that's loads of time. Yeah, it might sound like it now, but when you actually get into it, it's really not that much time at all. And sometimes students run out of time when they're answering their responses. Now, you can't get a lot of marks for this. However, we can award some AO1 marks if there is something in your plan that you have not mentioned throughout your essay. So let's say, for example, you had 3 points planned to answer for section A of paper 1, and the exam invigilator calls 5 minutes, so you think, and you've got 2 of your points down, so you think, right, okay, instead of missing out on that conclusion, because the conclusion is a super important part, you go into your conclusion. Now, as examiners, we can then go back to your plan, so long as it is included on the given paper. So if it is on the page where the question is, the examiner will not receive it. It needs to be on the lined part where you write. We can go back to that, and we can look at that, and we can see whether or not we can award maybe a 1 or 2 marks for what you were going to talk about. It's not going to be a massive amount, but 1 or 2 marks can be the difference between one mark band and another mark band. The next part is obviously the business end of the essay response. It's the writing. Now, I would recommend that you spend around about 40 minutes on this. So 40 minutes on actually writing your response down. So, before we even get into tackling the question in itself, as in like doing the writing part, we need to ensure that we understand exactly what it is that the question is asking us. Because time and time again, what we see as teachers and as examiners is we see that students sometimes don't fully understand what the question is actually asking them about. And whilst everything that they're writing about is, it's great, it's factually correct, because it's not meeting the demands of the question, we can't give it any marks. So we must ensure before we start planning that we understand exactly what it is that the question is asking of us. What does it want us to do? And the way that I recommend to students that they do this is we go through a process of what we call bugs. We bugs the question, basically. Now, bugs stands for these 4 different phrases that I have got on the screen there. So first and foremost, we box off the command word or the command words. Sometimes there can be more than one command word within there, or it might be more of a command phrase. But by boxing off the command word, we can see exactly what it is that the question is asking us to do. Is it asking us to what extent? Is it asking us to assess? Okay. Next, we go into underlining the keywords, and this is absolutely pivotal for us in understanding exactly what it is that the question's asking us about. Which time period is it asking us about? Is it asking us about a particular monarch? Is it asking us about a particular leader? Is it asking us about a particular event? For example, is it asking us about a particular time period? And that helps us to focus our question because, and I'm going to give another Root G example here, but if you were answering a question that was asking you about the time period of 1918 to 1933, let's say, for example, it was asking you about attitudes towards democratic government, and one of your paragraphs focused around the Nazi period of 1933 to 1945, even if it is absolutely fantastic, factually correct, your evaluation's on point, we can't give you any marks because you've not focused on what the question is asking you, which is that particular time period of 1918 to 1933. The third thing we do is we're going to have a look at the question. Now, the thing with Edexcel A Level History in particular is all of the questions are worth exactly the same amount of marks, whether it's an AO1, an AO2 or an AO3. They're all worth 20 marks. So what we do is we have a look at the question and we think about what is the main assessment objective that question is tackling. Is it tackling AO1? Is it asking us to focus mainly on our knowledge and understanding? Is it asking us about AO2, which is our source inference skills? Or is its focus AO3, which is all about our ability to be able to understand historical interpretations? And then finally, we're going to move on to the S, which is the structure. What structure are we going to use? Now, I would recommend different structures depending on which assessment objective question you were tackling. So I wouldn't recommend tackling section A of paper 1 in the same way that you would tackle section C of paper 1, because the assessment objectives are different, the focus of the questions are different. So we need to think about what essay structure are we following. For AO1 question, we're going to be following introduction, main body, conclusion. And then we need to be thinking about what paragraph structure are we going to be following. Are we going to be following PEEL EEE, or are we going to be following a different paragraph structure? Now, it can be helpful to follow a paragraph structure because it helps you to showcase the flowing of your argument towards the examiner. So, first time we've looked at this question, I mentioned right at the beginning that it was going to be a question from Route G because that is the route that I teach. But again, if you are following along and you follow one of the other routes for papers 1 and 2, then just pick up, go onto the Edexcel website, choose a question that you would like to go through, and you can follow through with the same steps with your own question. But this is a question that I have chosen to look at. So, how far do you agree that democratic government was the main reason for political stability in the FRG in the years 1949 to 1989? So the first thing that we're going to do, I want us to imagine we're putting ourselves in the exam room. We've opened up our paper 1, and this is one of the questions that is given to us in section B. And we choose to go for this one. The first thing that we're going to do, so that we understand exactly what the question's asking us to do, is we are going to bugs that question. So what is the command word or words? Well, in this question, it is actually a command phrase. It's how far do you agree? So what the question is asking us is it's going to give us a statement. And it wants to know whether or not we think that statement is correct for causing or changing something. In this case, what the question wants to know is whether or not we think that democratic government was the main reason for political stability, or do we think that there was another reason for why political stability was achieved in the FRG between the years 1949 and 1989? So we've boxed off our command word. We know that it's asking for our opinion, and that's really important to note. You can't sit on the fence in an A-level history essay. You must come down on one side or the other. If you sit on the fence, you're only going to get splinters. You have to come down on one side or the other. So the question wants to know whether or not we think it was democratic government that was the main reason, or whether we think it was something else. Next step is we're going to underline the key words, because I know we've already talked about them a little bit there, but it's going to tell us exactly what the focus of the question is. In that, it's going to tell us which of the themes the question is asking us about, and any key events, key leaders, key time periods. So first and foremost, we're going to underline democratic government, because that is our reason. The question is asking us, do we think that democratic government was the main reason for political stability in the FRG? So what we've got there is our reason and the event that led to it. And then finally, we're going to underline 1949 to 1989, because whilst, yes, the mentioning of the FRG indicates to us that this would be the time period that we're talking about, it's important that we don't lose sight of that time period for two reasons. One, if you talk about in detail democratic government and political stability in the Weimar or Nazi period, then you aren't going to pick up marks, because the question is explicitly asking us about 1949 to 1989. But there's also another reason why that time period is important and why we need to keep it in the back of our minds. It's not focusing on a particular time period of the FRG. So it's not focusing on 1949 to 1970. So we're not going to be just focusing on Adenauer, Erhard and Kissinger. We're also going to be focusing on all of the other chancellors that came afterwards. You know, we're going to be focusing on Willy Brandt, we're going to be focusing on Schmidt, we're going to be focusing on Kohl as well. Basically, what I'm saying to you is you need to make sure that your response targets the whole time period. Otherwise, you're going to be limiting yourself because you're not fully assessing the full scope of the question. So if you only focus on the events of Adenauer's chancellorship, for example, in answering this question, yeah, you are right. But where you're going to be limited is the fact that you've not really assessed the full time period. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to have a glance at the question. It's been the focus of the video so far, but we know that it is an AO1 question. So it's asking us to demonstrate our knowledge and understanding here. And then finally, we're going to look at the structure. What structure are we going to use? So the one that I'm going to take you through is going to be introduction, main body, conclusion, which is regardless of what paragraph structure you follow, that should be the structure that your general essay is following. But in terms of paragraph structure, I'm going to take you through PEEL. So what about creating a plan then? Well, when we're creating a plan, these are the key questions that we need to be focusing on. We need to be thinking about. What is the actual focus of the question? What is the question asking us about? What is it asking us to explore? What is it asking us to look at? What is it asking us to debate on? Have we been given a specific time or event to focus on? In this case, yes, we have. We've been given a specific time in that we've been given 1949 to 1989, but we have also been given political stability. So we know that the main focus is going to be on theme 1. Now that doesn't mean that we can't bring in and draw on knowledge from the other 3 themes. We can, but the main focus of the question is theme 1, talking about political and governmental change throughout Germany. Your next step is you want to be thinking about what factors are you going to discuss. Now, there are an absolute wealth of factors out there that you could discuss for this question, far more than you could tackle in the 45 minutes that you've got for this question. Okay? We understand and we know that you're not going to be able to mention everything, and you must maintain that in your mind, okay? You must remember that we know and understand that it is not possible for you to talk about absolutely every single factor, every single cause, consequence, change, every single part of that particular question, okay? What I would recommend you do is you tackle the 3 that you're the most confident in talking about, the 3 that you know the most or you can remember the most about. Finally, you need to be thinking about what your overall judgment is going to be. Are you deciding that yes, you think that democratic government was the main reason for political stability in the FRG? Or are you going to argue that it was actually another reason, for example, economic developments that helped to create political stability in the FRG? And then you need to be thinking about what criteria are you using? How are you arriving at your judgment on whether or not it was democratic government that led to political stability in the FRG period? Well, you could look at criteria such as electoral turnout or election statistics. You could look at attitudes towards the political landscape within Germany. You could look at participation, for example. These are all just examples of what you could be looking at, but your criteria is about how are you forming that judgment. You know, I said to you earlier, it's like thinking about what you're wearing. When you get up on a morning, you might look outside, you might think about how you feel, and that's how you decide what you're going to put on that particular day. That's your criteria, the weather. So for your plan, remember to spend around about 5 minutes completing this. Now, there's no particular structure. You might want to do a mind map. You might want to do a little table. You might want to just jot down some things. But I would always recommend completing a plan, because remember that we can award AO1 marks if your plan mentions something that isn't mentioned in your essay. Now, as I say, it's not many. It's not a massive amount, but it can be the difference between 1 mark band and another. It can be the difference between one grade and another. So let's get into the actual essay then. Let's think about what we need to do. Now, an introduction for your AO1 questions is an absolute must. You must do an introduction. Think about it as being a bit like a sandwich. We're going to have the introduction as the first piece of bread, the main body is our filling, and then the conclusion is that second piece of bread. You know, we need to have all of those components in order to make this essay sandwich. So what does your introduction need to do? It has to do 3 key things. First and foremost, it has to show the context. It has to show the examiner that you understand exactly what the scope of the question is. Now, the scope of this question is political stability. It's asking us, what was the main reason for why political stability was achieved in the FRG between 1949 and 1989? Now, the question's given us one factor, which is democratic government. We need to think of another 2 at least. So we need to show the examiner that we understand exactly what they are asking us to do. And one of the best ways we can do that is by rewording the question. I don't mean regurgitating the question, like writing out the question again in your introduction. But what I mean by that is actually putting the question into your own words, telling the examiner, telling your teacher what the question is asking you. Secondly, we need to be defining any key terms. In this case, this particular question, what do we mean by political stability? What is political stability? Now, yes, your examiner and your teacher is going to know what we mean by political stability, but what it shows us is that you understand it, and you can refer back to that when you are considering how political stability was achieved within the FRG. You also want to ensure that you introduce the factors that you will be discussing. So one of them, because as we've said, the questions gave us one, is democratic government. But what are the other 2 factors that you're going to talk about? I've mentioned that you could talk about economic developments, for example, but you could also talk about the impact of terrorism, for example, within the FRG, and how that led to political stability. Finally, you've got to provide your judgment. You've got to answer the question. And remember that judgment needs to flow throughout. So yes, you're going to evaluate. Yes, you are going to critique. But ultimately, you need to come back to that judgment. So if you're saying, yes, that you think that it was democratic government that led to political stability in the FRG, you are going to challenge that by saying, whilst, yes, democratic government helped towards the development of political stability, economic changes and economic stability also contributed towards political stability within the FRG. You also need to provide a brief justification for your judgment as well. Now, I always say to my students, think of the Backstreet Boys. The Backstreet Boys tell us to tell me why. That's what we want. We want you to tell us why. Now, we don't want War and Peace in your introduction. That's going to come in the main body. But we do want to know what your justification is for your introduction. Okay, for your judgment. Why have you arrived at that judgment? Now, you can say at the end of your introduction, the evidence strongly suggests that the main reason for political stability in the FRG between 1949 and 1989 was the actions of democratic government. And I'd be like, okay, that's cool, that's great. You have provided a judgment, but you've not justified it. And that would be the little thing that would be missing. It is, again, like I keep saying, it is the difference between one mark band and another. So let's have a look at an introduction then. So this is an introduction that I have written that you could use to introduce this essay question. So I'll read it out and then we'll go through it. The FRG was created as a democratic nation in 1949 following the splitting of Germany into 2 separate countries. The FRG is credited with relative political stability during its existence. However, historians have disagreed on the reasons for this. Political stability can be defined as a period where government or a political system is functioning smoothly. This was evident within the FRG as there were no major collapses of government between 1949 and 1989. Some historians have pointed to democratic government as being the main reason for political stability during this period. However, other factors should also be considered, such as the success of the social market economy and the exclusion of committed Nazis from positions of power. Overall, the most important reason for political stability in the FRG was democratic government, as this institution implemented many of the decisions that contributed towards political stability. So how have I met my 3 questions there in my introduction? Well, I've showcased to the examiner that I understand what the focus of the question is. Okay, I have provided them with a very, very, very brief background, and I have reworded the question. And by brief background, I mean a sentence. Okay, so if I pop the laser pointer on, you can see here in this section here, in fact, this might be a bit better. So where I'm underlining in purple now, here is where I am providing that context. Sorry for my not very straight lines. I am doing this on a laptop. So there, as you can see, I've provided a brief history, but here I've also reworded the question. And as you can see, I haven't just regurgitated the question, but I've shown the examiner that I understand what it is that I'm talking about. Now if we pop to red, you can see here, I'm just going to underline defined, I've provided a definition. So I've provided a definition for what political stability is. Now, this is where my criteria is. This is how I'm going to decide whether or not the factors that I am discussing have contributed towards political stability. So the definition for political stability that I've given is that it's a period where government or a political system is functioning smoothly. So what I'm going to be looking at is how did democratic government lead to the FRG's government or the political system of the FRG functioning smoothly. And equally, because I've mentioned my other factors as well. So here, I've mentioned the success of the social market economy, and I've mentioned the exclusion of committed Nazis. There, I'm also going to be looking at how those factors contributed towards the achievement of political stability within the FRG. Finally, I've provided my judgment as well here. So, I have said in this introduction that I agree with the question, that it was democratic government that was the most important reason for political stability. And what I've provided is a brief justification here as well. So, as this institution implemented many of the decisions that contributed towards political stability. So I'm going to develop that further into my main body, because what I'm going to be talking about is that whilst, yes, the social market economy and the successes that it brought did help to bring about political stability in the FRG, whilst yes, the exclusion of committed Nazis also helped to bring around political stability, ultimately both of those factors were decisions that were made by democratic government. So without that government, without that democratic government or those governments, would those decisions have been made? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. But do you see how I've hit those key parts there of the introduction? I've showed the examiner that I understand the content, the context. I've reworded the question. I've given a definition which helps to provide my criteria for how I'm going to form my judgment. I've given the factors that I am going to explore. So I've also discussed, I've just realised I've not underlined it there, but I have also discussed democratic government there, and then I've also provided my judgment with a very brief justification as well. So what about structuring your paragraphs? Well, I've mentioned this already before to you. I've said that the structure that I recommend for paragraphs is a PEEEL approach. But there are plenty of paragraph structures out there, and I would recommend finding the one that works the best for you. But for today, we're going to go through PEEL. So what actually is PEEL? Well, PEEL starts with the P, which is the point. What's the point of your paragraph? What you're talking about? You've got to state the factor that you will be discussing here. Now, one of the key things that I say to students is I recommend that you don't write your history essays in the first person. Does that mean that you can't do it? No. I have came across many a level 5 response that has been written using the first person. Okay, the reason that I suggest to students, I recommend that they don't write in the first person, that they write in the third person, is because that is what's expected of you at university, and it gets you into good habits. Okay, so as I'm going through this, you probably noticed that with the introduction, I'm going to be using a lot of the third person. But if you find that difficult, if you are struggling to get to grips with that, or you just don't feel comfortable doing it, you can use the first person, okay? But your point shouldn't really be a massive part of your paragraph. It literally needs to be maybe a sentence or two maximum. It's just telling us what the factor is that you're talking about. So in the case of the introduction that we've just looked at there, are you talking about democratic government? Is the focus going to be on the success of the social market economy, or is the focus of this paragraph going to be on the exclusion of committed Nazis from governmental positions? Okay. Next, we're going to move into the explain part. Now, this is where we're going to develop that point a little bit further. If you say in your essay response, one factor that led to the achievement of political stability in the FRG between 1949 and 1989 was the actions of a democratic government. Your teacher, your examiner is going to be like, yeah, that is right, absolutely. But I'm going to go back to the Backstreet Boys. I want you to tell me why. How does the factor answer your question? Okay, how did democratic government lead to political stability? How did the success of the social market economy lead to political stability? How did the exclusion of committed Nazis lead to the creation and achievement of political stability in the FRG? Again, this isn't going to be a massive part of your essay. It's going to be slightly longer than your point, but it's not the main body of your paragraph, if that makes sense, if you kind of break it down into chunks. But it is a super, super important part. The most important part of your paragraph is here. It's the evidence. This part is super, super important because this is where you are backing up your argument. Now, one of the beautiful things about history, one of the things that I truly, truly love about this discipline is that as long as we can back up our argument with evidence, by that I mean actual substantiated evidence, we can argue pretty much any factor that we would choose. Now, that's not to say that there is no technically quote-unquote wrong answer. If you said, for example, one of the reasons for why political stability was achieved in the FRG between 1918 and 1989 was the actions of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I think that you would be pretty stretched to argue that. Okay, but evidence is the most important part. You need to be able to back up your argument. If you do not provide evidence, you are massively limiting yourself to those lower mark bands because you're not showcasing to the examiner, you're not showcasing to your teacher that you understand the topic or the area, the factor, the theme that you are discussing. The evidence is showing the examiner how you're supporting your argument. What events, people, actions can you refer to? So when thinking about democratic government, well, how did democratic government lead to political stability? I mean, yes, it did, but what events can you refer to? What people can you refer to? So in this case, you could talk about Willy Brandt and Willy Brandt's resignation as Chancellor of the FRG in helping to uphold faith in the political system after the Gilham affair. Now, PEE that we've just discussed there, your point, explain and your evidence, is part of quote-unquote normal 2E PEEL. Where the third E comes in is your evaluation, and this is how you push up into level 5 on the mark scheme. No evaluation is going to limit your marks. We need to be able to see the alternative side. On the other hand, however, although, you need to showcase to the examiner that you have considered both sides of the argument. So whilst yes, democratic government did lead to political stability, could you argue that in some ways democratic government maybe hindered political stability? You could also link into your other factors as well. Now, this is the easiest way to evaluate, and it showcases synergy throughout your essay. So you could say, for example, in your paragraph discussing the impact of democratic government on the creation of political stability, you could say, however, whilst the actions of democratic government were important in securing political stability in the FRG, the exclusion of committed Nazis from governmental positions also helped to contribute towards political stability. Now, going with the theme of the judgment that I gave in the introduction, what you could then come back with in your link is, however, this decision was made by democratic government. The end of your paragraph should always link back up to the question. It should always answer the question. You need to think of it as a bit like a mini conclusion. It doesn't need to be massive, couple of sentences maybe, but what we're thinking of is how important is this factor. So that particular factor of democratic government, for example, how important is that to achieving political stability in the FRG? How many times should you PEEL? You should PEEL 3 times. 3 times is enough if you do it in depth to be able to get all of that content, demonstrate all of that knowledge, showcase all of your skills that you need to be able to gain a level 5 in your response. So let's have a look then at an exemplar paragraph. So we're going to start with our point, and I'm going to stick with that first factor that we've been discussing, which is democratic government. So the point that I've started this paragraph with is a significant factor in achieving political stability in the FRG were the actions of democratic government as it eased tensions between different political parties and helped to subdue the rise of extremism within the FRG. So what I've done there, if I get my pen back out, is I have mentioned my factor in my first sentence there. So the actions of democratic government. So the examiner already knows, just from reading that first sentence of my paragraph, what factor I am going to be discussing. And I've given just a very, very, very brief of why. Of course, the next section is where we're going to say a little bit more about the why. So here's the explain part. Prior to the creation of the FRG in 1949, Germany had a negative experience of democracy and did not have a stable functioning democratic government and I've just realised I've put extended stability. That should say period. My apologies. But what's important there is, yes, I have mentioned a time period outside of the scope of the question. However, it is important because it relates, okay? It helps in terms of setting the scene. What I have not done, however, is gone into massive detail. I have literally just said that prior to the FRG, Germany had experienced extreme political instability and had a very, very negative experience of democracy. That is all that needs to be said. Between 1949 and 1989, West Germans experienced relative political stability, and this could be argued to be as a result of democratic government. So what I've done there is I've gave a little bit more context behind my factor and what it is that I'm going to be discussing. So, in your paragraphs, I would recommend trying to get in at least 3 pieces of evidence, because the key bulky parts of your paragraph are going to be those last 2 E's. It's going to be your evidence and it's going to be your evaluation. Your point, your explain, and your link are going to be relatively short, perhaps maybe 2, maybe 3 sentences maximum. But your main body, the chunky bit of it, is going to be your evidence. So we're going to have a look at how I've implemented evidence and then utilise that to support my argument and to link back to the question in relation to this particular question. So I'll read this part out and then we'll break it down and go through it. For example, the creation of the Basic Law in 1949 outlined the democratic rights and freedoms of all German citizens. The Basic Law set out that all Germans would be protected from prejudice and over-excessive government in order to ensure that the atrocities of 1933 to 45 were not repeated. Article 1, for example, declared human dignity as inviolable, placing individual rights at the heart of the state. This led to political stability within the FRG, as Germans had no reason to protest, therefore allowing government to run smoothly. These rights were upheld by significant changes to the democratic framework in Germany, including the creation of an independent Supreme Court to handle issues with democracy. Let's break this down. There's 2 key parts of this evidence, and then we're going to break it down a little bit further. So, this part here, within the purple, is my actual evidence, okay? It's how I am backing up my argument. So I am stating here that the reason that democratic government led to political stability was because of the creation of the Basic Law Constitution within the FRG, which guaranteed individual rights. Now, again, this isn't something that I would expect you to explain in the question, nor is it something that I would explain in your response. But if we think back in terms of 1918 to 1945, if we look at the Weimar Constitution, individual rights were never really protected within the Weimar Constitution. So it is an important step that the FRG makes individual rights, puts individual rights at the very, very heart of its constitution. So that purple part there is my actual evidence. It is my examples. Okay, so here I am relating to the Basic Law. I'm talking about how it placed individual rights at the centre of the FRG, and I've also given a particular example of one of the articles from the Basic Law. The second part, which I'm going to put in a different colour, here, this is how that evidence relates to my question. Now, it's all good and well mentioning the evidence. It's all good and well mentioning your examples. So, you know, your teacher, an examiner would read through your paragraph, would see your evidence and think, wow, that's great. You know, this particular candidate has got a good understanding of what's going on. But again, I'm going to relate you back to the Backstreet Boys. I need you to tell me why. Why? Why does that particular evidence showcase, how does that particular evidence showcase that democratic government led to political stability within the FRG? That's what the blue section is doing for us. It tells us how that led. So why that evidence is significant, why that evidence is important. Is it the only piece of evidence that we could relate to for this question? Absolutely not, because we're going to look at another further two pieces. But it tells us how the creation of the Basic Law led to political stability, because it really helped to bring down the number of protests that occurred within the FRG. Now, that's not to say that there were no protests in the FRG. That's something we're going to come on to later. But it is to say that in terms of talking about individual rights, human rights, dignity, it really helped to bring down protests and really helped to drive up support for government. So what about our second piece of evidence? Again, we're going to do the same. We'll read through it and then we'll break it down and showcase how it tackles each of those different parts. So, another example of how the actions of democratic government created political stability was the exclusion of extremist parties from the Bundestag. In 1953, the Basic Law was amended to include the 5% rule. This stated that all political parties had to gain at least 5% of the vote to have any parliamentary representation. This worked to the benefit of the major democratic parties, turning the Bundestag into a democratic three-party house, and excluded smaller, more extremist, non-democratic parties. This helped to create political stability as the major parties of the Bundestag were all in support of democracy. So whilst their political opinions may have differed, they were all committed to establishing, maintaining and protecting democracy. This reduced political challenges from within the Bundestag and therefore allowed the functioning of government. So let's break it down again into those two sections. So, I'm going to go here first. So here again is my actual evidence, it's my examples. And the particular example that I have made reference to here is the introduction of the 5% rule in 1953, which, as we've explained there, helped to exclude any extremist parties from the Bundestag because a party had to achieve at least 5% of the vote in any German federal election in order to gain representation within the Bundestag, which essentially created this democratic three-party house between the CDU, the SPD and the FDP as well. I always get the SPD and the SDP mixed around because of with teaching politics, the SDP being a former British political party. But anyway, moving on. So that's my evidence for this, my examples for this particular piece of evidence. So I've made reference to a change to the Basic Law, the 5% rule, and I have explained what that is, which showcases again to the examiner that I have got that knowledge and understanding. Now, if I just said there that another example of how the actions of democratic government created political stability was the exclusion of extremist parties from the Bundestag, in 1953 the Basic Law was amended to include the 5% rule. Your examiner is going to be like, that's fantastic, that is absolutely correct, there is nothing factually wrong with that. But I'm going to be left wanting that little bit more, that little bit extra is what we're going to be looking for. The second part, as before, is our explanation. How does that evidence answer our question? How and why does that evidence support our particular argument? Now, remember, for this essay, we're arguing that democratic government was the main reason for political stability. So how does this evidence support that argument? And what you see here as well is a reference back to the criteria as well. Remember in that introduction of how we defined political stability. Okay, what I'm referencing there at the end of that piece of evidence is that particular definition of how political stability was achieved. So I've explained how that particular piece of evidence, of 5% rule, led towards political stability, in that the three major parties of Germany were all in support of democracy, whilst they did have differing views and they did disagree on aspects of policy. Ultimately, all three of them were committed towards democracy, and that really helped to cement political stability within the FRG. And then what I've done there is I've made a reference back to the criteria. So I'm showcasing again to the examiner that I'm utilising, how I'm utilising that criteria to formulate my judgment. Now, you might feel that by saying these things, you might be like, oh, it's like sucking eggs. It's like teaching, I don't know, somebody to do something that they've done all their lives, right? But examiners are often given a lot of script to mark, and we love it when you make things clear for us and don't shroud things in mystery or make things oh, is it, isn't it, maybe, maybe not. It's nice when it's clear, okay? So make it clear. Final piece of evidence that we're going to relate to for this paragraph is here. We're going to be looking at the effective management of challenges. So again, we'll read through the paragraph, we'll separate it out, and we'll talk about how it's hitting that the necessities for the evidence part and how it's answering our question. A final example of how the actions of democratic government created political stability was the effective management of challenges towards government. One group that posed a significant challenge towards government was the Baader-Meinhof gang, operating in the 1970s. The group utilised terrorism in an attempt to overthrow the democratic government for a number of different reasons, including opposition to US involvement in Germany, state repression, and the perceived continuation of Nazism. Political stability was maintained due to the actions of democratic government through the implementation of anti-terrorism laws, such as the 1972 Radical Decree by Chancellor Schmidt. This contributed to the smooth running of government as it banned extremists from holding public sector jobs, therefore limiting their influence. So again, first part, my example, here we go, I'm going to go from here. So my example, talking about terrorism and in particular the Baader-Meinhof gang. Now, before I delve into that, what's really important about this piece of evidence is the year. Okay, it's the time period. My two other pieces of evidence that I've used have focused on the earlier period of the FRG. What this piece of evidence is helping to do is meet the requirement of the scope of the question. I'm showcasing how the actions of democratic government throughout the period of the FRG contributed towards political stability. So I'm not just focusing on one particular area of the FRG or one particular time period of the FRG. I'm showcasing again to the examiner that I understand, I have knowledge and understanding of the entire period that is being asked by the question. So the particular example that I'm giving here is the government's reactions and the government's dealing of the Baader-Meinhof gang, which helped to cement faith, it helped to cement trust, and it helped to cement a sense of responsibility within citizens of the FRG in the government, because they saw them dealing effectively and swiftly with this particular challenge. Now, this part is something that we're going to come back onto a little bit later on throughout the essay. And then again, our explanation of as to how that particular piece of evidence meets the requirements of the question, how it supports our argument, is given in the second part. So we've made reference to the 1972 radical decree that was introduced by Chancellor Schmidt, which banned extremists from holding public sector jobs and limiting their influence. So that is showcasing how effective government helped to cement political stability. And again, smooth running of government. I'm making reference back again to what I'd said in the introduction. Next part, it's not going to be as long as the evidence, but it is still quite a chunky part of it, is going to be our evaluation. Now remember, your evaluation is key for getting into level 5. No evaluation, you're not getting in level 5, okay? And we all want to get in level 5, absolutely. So we are going to evaluate. So again, I'm going to read through this part of the paragraph, and then we will talk about how it links into the question and how it's meeting the demands. While democratic government played a key role in maintaining political stability in the FRG, it was not the sole factor. The social market economy arguably had a greater impact, as it provided economic security and reduced public dissatisfaction, which in turn lowered support for extremist movements. Additionally, the exclusion of committed Nazis from power helped to restore faith in democracy and avoid the instability that could have arisen had former Nazi officials held influence. Therefore, while democracy was a key factor in stability, economic success and the denazification process can also be argued to be significant in securing long-term political stability in the FRG. Okay, so what's particularly important about this is I have mentioned my two other factors within the evaluation here. Now, I have not gone into as much detail in my evaluation as what I will do when I actually assess these factors on their own merits. But what I am doing is I am linking in, and again, it's going to show that synergy. So we're starting with our factor that says, yeah, it was democratic government, and then we're going to explore the social market economy, and then we're going to explore the exclusion of committed Nazis. But what I'm doing here is I'm showcasing that I have considered both sides of the argument to say that yes, democratic government can be attributed as being the main cause for political stability in the FRG, and that's what I've explained in my evidence. And in my evaluation, I'm showcasing how I've actually considered the other side of the argument and considered that perhaps other factors can also be considered to be important in the creation of political stability within the FRG itself. Then finally, we're going to finish off with our link back. Remember, we think of this as being a bit like a mini conclusion. It's tying up the loose ends of the paragraph. It's putting a wee bow on the top, okay? So overall, the actions of democratic government were the cause of political stability in the FRG between 1949 and 1989. The implementation of the Basic Law, the 5% rule, and the effective management of challenges all helped to create an environment in which political stability could flourish. Whilst the creation of the social market economy and the exclusion of Nazis from public office both also contributed to the smooth running of government during this period, ultimately they are both in themselves the actions of democratic government. Therefore, political stability in the FRG was achieved through democratic government. So what I have done there is I have made reference back to the evidence that I discussed in my paragraph. I've mentioned the basic law, 5% rule, and the effective management of challenges. I have also mentioned the importance of my other factors. And then what I've done is I've explained why I disagree with them being the most important factor in creating political stability. Because I've said here that they are actions of democratic government in themselves. And then finally, at the end, I have provided my judgment there. So that is an exemplar paragraph. So, tips from an examiner then. It's really important to know that it's not always the best approach for an A-level history paper to take a for and against approach. Now, this is something that I've seen as a teacher year after year of year 12 students coming up from GCSE. At GCSE, you're taught to write in more of a for and against manner, in that yes, it can be argued this, yes, it can be argued this, no, because of that, no, because of that. It could also be argued because of this. Now, sometimes in A-level history, we can take an agree-disagree approach if the question's asking us how far do we agree with something. However, it's not always the best approach to take. And sometimes it's actually better to take a factorial approach to answering the question, because sometimes that for against approach can actually limit your marks. What we mean by a factorial approach is taking factors and considering the positives and negatives of each factor within the designated paragraph. And that's exactly what we've just done there. We've taken the factor of democratic government and we've considered how democratic government can be used as an argument for why political stability was achieved in the FRG, but we've also considered other factors which could be considered to have contributed towards political stability within the FRG as well. Now, taking this approach will help you to reach a level 5 if that's what's appropriate for the question, because again, it's showcasing a deep level of knowledge and understanding and application to the examiner. So, what about writing your conclusion? I've got 3 important points for your conclusion. The first one is nothing new. Let's review. Your conclusion should never, ever, ever underlined, emboldened, lots and lots of sparks coming off it. Should never contain any new information. There should never ever be anything new in your conclusion. Your conclusion serves as a summary. It is tying everything together. It's bringing everything to an end. It should never include anything new. And to be honest, that piece of advice goes across no matter what subject or discipline you're studying, whether it's history, politics, sociology, psychology, English language, English literature, law. Your conclusions should never, ever, ever contain anything new. It serves as a summary of the debate that you've had in your main body. It needs to weigh up. Your conclusion needs to show that you've considered all sides of the argument. Now, you've already started to show the examiner that throughout your paragraphs with your evaluation. But you need to think about how are the factors linked. So we did that. If I go back, so if we look here, it says I've shown how the factors link together. That even though yes, social market economy and the exclusions of Nazis was important, ultimately they in themselves were the actions of democratic government. So I've shown how my 3 factors link together there. You also need to make sure that you talk about how important the factors are. So why has the evidence suggested to you that democratic government is the most important factor in achieving political stability? And then finally, you need to answer the question. You've got to provide your judgment with justification. Your judgment should not change. It shouldn't be different in your introduction to what it is in your conclusion. Your judgment in your intro should be the same one in your conclusion, okay? To showcase that synergy, to showcase how you've arrived at that judgment. And you need to make sure that you justify it. Again, the main part of your justification is, of course, in your main body, but this is your summary. So, yes, you think that democratic government was the main reason for political stability, but why? Give us a brief judgment. Give us a brief justification as to why you believe that. So let's have a look at an example conclusion then. In conclusion, it is evident from the evidence assessed that the main reason for political stability in the FRG was democratic government. It is important to recognise the impact of the creation of the social market economy on political stability in the FRG. Creating economic prosperity helped to ward off the conditions which made the rise of extremism likely. Equally, the banning of Nazis from public office helped to communicate both domestically and internationally a sense of separation from the previous Nazi regime and an acceptance of democratic power in the FRG. However, ultimately, the implementation of these ideas was the result of democratic government. The creation of the Basic Law, the implementation of the 5% rule, and the 1972 Radical Decree all contributed towards support for the democratic system, which in turn helped the government to run smoothly. Therefore, the most important reason for political stability in the FRG was democratic government. So what I've done there is I've summarised my 3 factors, I've talked about the importance of them, and I've gave a justification for why I think it was democratic government that was the most important factor. And ultimately, my judgment is the same here as what it was in my introduction. So some final top tips then. Plan, plan, plan. It ensures that you know which direction your argument is going to take, and you are much less likely to lose focus of the question and go completely off on a tangent if you've got a plan. Think of it as being like a recipe when you're cooking a meal. Okay, if you've got a recipe to follow, you know exactly which steps you're going to be doing. You know when you need to add the butter, you know when you need to add the spices, you know when you need to add the pasta. A plan is exactly the same. It helps you to stay on track. You need to keep a consistent judgment. Your judgment needs to be the same throughout your entire essay. If you're coming down on the side of saying, for this particular one, that yes, democratic government was the main reason for political stability, that should not be different in your conclusion. And finally, you need to focus on the wording, okay? You need to utilise the wording of the question in your response. Link back to those key words. So throughout that you've seen, I mentioned political stability loads and loads and loads because I'm linking back. I'm showcasing my links back to the question, that I understand what it is that I am discussing. I am applying my knowledge to that particular question. So I hope that was helpful for anybody who is preparing for Edexcel A Level History, whether you're in year 12 or year 13. I hope that was super helpful for you. And if you'd like more A-Level History content, please subscribe and follow, and I'll make sure to post more videos including tackling those tricky AO2 and AO3 questions. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.